Hey y'all. Yesterday we took a look at solving equations by graphing. So you make sure everything is equal to 0 and then you look for where it crosses the x-axis. Those are also called your zeros, your roots, your x-intercepts, your solution. So that was method number 1. Method number 2 that we're going to get to today is we can solve a quadratic equation by factoring. So that is going to be the second way that we do it. So we can solve by factoring. Now, when you factor, think back to, it's been a couple of weeks, but in the last unit where your first step is to pull out the greatest common factor that goes on the outside, you might have to set up 2 sets of parentheses, etc. and so on. So factoring, if you need to flip back to your factoring notes, there's nothing wrong with that because today's method is going to be solving by factoring. So I got 4 examples down here that we're going to do. I got 2 in this box and then 1 in the other boxes. So the first one, we're going to solve this by factoring. X squared minus 6x minus 16 equals 0. We're looking for 2 numbers that multiply to give me negative 16, add to give us negative 6. And even before I jump into that, your first step when you do any kind of factoring is to check for a greatest common factor. These 3 terms do not have anything in common, so I'm technically skipping that step. So we'll go ahead and set up our parentheses. Something times something has to give me x squared. That's just x and x. And then something times something. Okay. All right. So computer, it was trying to update in the middle of my video here. So we're back. So something times something has to give me x squared. And then something times something has to multiply to give me negative 16, add to give me negative 6. So those 2 numbers are negative 8 and 2. When you solve by factoring, you set each factor equal to 0. So x minus 8 is a factor, and x plus 2 is a factor. You go through and you solve each one. We add 8, so x equals 8. Subtract 2, x equals negative 2. So our 2 answers are positive 8 and negative 2. And we have just solved this quadratic equation by factoring. So the first part, you factor, you do all your parentheses, GCF, all that good stuff. And then you take your factors and you set it equal to 0. So let's try another one. So we got 6x squared plus 9x equals 0. So we are going to first figure out if it has a greatest common factor, which it does. I can see that they both share an x, and I also can see that they're both divisible by 3. So 3x is my greatest common factor. So 3x is going to go on the outside. Leftover factors are going to go on the inside. So 3x times something gives me 6x squared. That's 2x. 3x times something gives me 9x, that's 3. So what I did here was found the greatest common factor. The first one that we did not have a greatest common factor, and that's okay, but this one did have a greatest common factor. So your greatest common factor goes on the outside and everything else goes on the inside. The beautiful thing with factoring is that you can check your work. 3x times 2x gives me 6x squared, so check there. 3x plus 3 is 9x, so check there. Now you set each factor equal to 0. So 3x equals 0, and 2x plus 3 equals 0. You go through and you solve each one. The opposite of multiplying by 3 is to divide both sides by 3. So I got x equals 0. Over here, I am going to do a step in my head here. I'm going to subtract 3 from both sides. So that gives me 2x equals negative 3. And the opposite of multiplying by 2 is to divide by 2. We get negative 3 halves. So our 2 solutions are 0 and negative 3 halves. Those are our 2 answers. All right, moving on. So we had 2 examples there on factoring. Number 2, 4x squared minus 25 equals 0. Both of these are perfect square numbers. Okay. 2 times 2 gives me 4, and 5 times 5 gives me 25. So that's how I know that these are perfect square numbers. That means that these are going to factor into the same thing. So they're going to factor into the same thing. So 4x squared is going to give me 2x and 2x. And then negative 25 is going to factor into 5 and 5. I need the terms to cancel out. So one's going to be plus and one's going to be minus. And this is the factorization. I said each factor equal to 0. So 2x plus 5 equals 0. And 2x minus 5 equals 0. Okay, so set each factor equal to 0. Now here we go. We're going to solve the equation. Opposite of plus 5 is to subtract 5 from both sides. Opposite of multiplying by 2 is to divide both sides by 2. So we got negative 5 halves. I'm going to go through and do the same thing over here. So we're solving the equation. We're doing opposite operations. Add 5 to both sides. That's going to give me 2x equals 5. The opposite of multiplying by 2 is to divide by 2. So x equals 5 halves. So those are my answers, negative 5 halves and positive 5 halves. All right, moving on to number 3. So that problem is 3x squared minus 20x minus 7 equals 0. Now, this is one of the problems that we're going to have to do the 4-step method with. So this is one of the ones where we have to go through and we got to do the 4-step method because we are not looking for two numbers that multiply to give me negative 7, add to give me negative 20. So we got to go through those 4 steps. So step 1. Again, you might need to go back a couple it's in last unit a couple of sections ago when we did factoring. So we're going to go through the 4-step method because this one has a different number in the front than the other problems. So this one here was 1x squared. So we were looking for two numbers that multiply to give me negative 16, add to give me negative 6. This problem is not going to work out that way. So we're going to go through the 4 steps. Step 1 says multiply the first and the last number. So 3 times negative 7, that gives me x squared minus 20x minus 21. So step 1, I multiply the first and the last number. Step 2, factor like normal. So we need to think of two numbers that multiply to give me negative 21, add to give me negative 20. So it has to multiply to give me negative 21, add to give me negative 20. So those numbers are negative 21 and 1. Step 3, divide by the first number in the problem. Our first number in this problem is the number 3. So that's my leading coefficient where my pen is pointing at. So I need to divide by 3, and I need to divide by 3. Once you divide each of your numbers by 3, you need to reduce it if possible. So 21 divided by 3 is going to give me 7. And then this is going to stay a fraction. And last but not least, you need to get rid of any kind of fractions that you have. So this 1/3, we will multiply just this one section by 3. Because to get rid of a fraction, you multiply by the denominator. So this is going to give me x minus 7. 3 times x is 3x. And 3 times 1/3 is 1. Now we're about 90% done with the problems. We now have the factors. X minus 7 is a factor and 3x plus 1 is a factor. We now need to take each factor and set it equal to 0. So x minus 7, set that equal to 0 and we'll solve it in just a minute. And 3x plus 1 is a factor. Set it equal to 0 and we will solve it in just a minute. So we'll go through. We're going to add 7 to both sides because that's the opposite of subtracting 7. So add 7, add 7. That's going to give me positive 7. This one here, we got a couple steps, but we still can solve it. Subtract 1, subtract 1. So that's going to give me 3x equals negative 1. The opposite of multiplying by 3 is to divide, and we'll get a fraction. But there is nothing wrong with a fraction. So this is solving by factoring, and we are going to do one more because when you solve by factoring, you have to make sure the problem equals 0. So just like we saw yesterday with the graphing method, how it had to equal 0, when you solve by factoring, it has to equal 0 as well. So equals 0, equals 0, equals 0, equals 0. So move everything over to the left side and set it equal to 0. So I want to do one problem where it's not set equal to 0 so you can know what to do. So I'm going to jump around. I'm down here on another page here. And we're going to solve this equation by factoring. I need to make sure that it equals 0. So I'm going to do 2 steps in one. This is positive 8x. I'm going to subtract 8x. This is negative 15. I'm going to add 15. I'm going to move everything to one side. So x squared minus 8x plus 15 equals 0. So again, I did a couple of steps in my head, but let me say that verbally for you. It was positive 8x. We subtracted it because that's how you move across the equal sign. You do opposite. This is negative 15. I added it. Again, you do opposite operation so that my problem is equal to 0. So if you're going to solve by graphing or factoring, make sure the problem is equal to 0. Now we'll go through and we'll solve this by factoring. We'll set up our 2 sets of parentheses. And we'll fill in our x's. We are thinking of 2 numbers that multiply to give me 15, add to give me negative 8. Multiplies to give me 15, adds to give me negative 8. So those numbers are negative 5 and negative 3. From here, we set each factor equal to 0 and we solve it. Okay, these are one-step equations. I'm sure you can do them in your head. Add 5, that gives me 5. Add 3, that gives me 3. And now we know how to solve equations by factoring. Check for a greatest common factor. If you have one, that goes on the outside. If not, go ahead and do your 2 sets of parentheses. And if you have a different number in the front besides the number 1, then you're going to have to go through those 4 steps.